one of the most stylish sergeants, who approached me with the following little speech, evidently the result of some elaboration: "I tink myself happy dis New Year's Day, for salute my own Cunnel. Dis day last year I was a servant to a Gunnel ob a Secesh, but now I hab de privilege for my salute my own Cunnel." That officer, with the utmost sincerity, reciprocated the sentiment. About 10 o'clock the people began to collect by land and also by water, in steamers sent by General Saxton for the purpose, and from that time all the avenues of approach were thronged. The multitude were chiefly colored women, with gay handkerchiefs on their heads, and a sprinkling of men, with that peculiar, respectable look which these people always have on Sundays and holidays. There were many white visitors also, ladies on horseback and in carriages, superintendents and teachers, officers and cavalrymen. Our companies were marched to the neighborhood of the plantation, and allowed to sit or stand, as at the Sunday services. The platform was occupied by ladies and dignitaries, and by the band of the 8th Maine, which kindly volunteered for the occasion. The colored people filled up all the vacant openings in the beautiful grove around, and there was a cordon of mounted visitors beyond. Above, the great live oak branches and their trailing moss; beyond the people, a glimpse of the blue river. The services began at 11:30 o'clock, with prayer by our chaplain, Mr. Fowler, who is always, on such occasions, simple, reverential, and impressive. Then the President's proclamation was read by Dr. W. H. Brisbane, a thing infinitely appropriate, a South Carolinian addressing South Carolinians, for he was reared among these very islands, and here long since emancipated his own slaves. Then the colors were presented to us by the Reverend Mr. French, a chaplain who brought them from the donors in New York. All this was according to the programme. Then followed an incident so simple, so touching, so utterly unexpected and startling, that I can scarcely believe it on recalling, though it gave the keynote to the whole day. The very moment the speaker had ceased, and just as I took and waved the flag, which now for the first time meant anything to these poor people, there suddenly arose, close beside the platform, a strong male voice, but rather cracked and elderly, into which two women's voices instantly blended, singing, as if by an impulse that could no more be repressed than the morning note of the song-sparrow: "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." People looked at each other, and then at us on the platform, to see whence came this interruption, not set down in the bills. Firmly and irrepressibly the quavering voices sang on, verse after verse. Others of the colored people joined in. Some whites on the platform began, but I motioned them to silence. I never saw anything so eclectic. It made all other words cheap. It seemed the choked voice of a race, at last, unloosed. Nothing could be more wonderfully unconscious. Art could not have dreamed of a tribute to the day of Jubilee that should be so affecting. History will not believe it, and when I came to speak of it, after it was ended, tears were everywhere. If you could have heard how quaint and innocent it was! Old Tiff and his children might have sung it, and close before me was a little slave boy, almost white, who seemed to belong to the party, and even he must join in. Just think of it! The first day they had ever had a country, the first flag they had ever seen which promised anything to their people, and here, while mere spectators stood in silence, waiting for my stupid words, these simple souls burst out in their lay, as if it were by their own hearths at home. When they stopped, there was nothing to do for it but to speak, and I went on, but the life of the whole day was in those unknown people's song. Receiving the flags, I gave them into the hands of two fine-looking men, jet black, as color guard, and they also spoke, and very effectively, Sergeant Prince Rivers and Corporal Robert Sutton. The regiment sang "Marching Along," and then General Saxton spoke, in his own simple, manly way, and Mrs. Francis D. Gage spoke very sensibly to the women, and Judge Stickney, from Florida, added something, and then some gentlemen sang an ode, and the regiment the John Brown song, and then they went to their beef and molasses. Everything was very orderly, and they seemed to have a very gay time. Most of the visitors had far to go, and so dispersed before the dress parade, though the band stayed to enliven it. In the evening we had letters from home, and General Saxton had a reception at his house, from which I excused myself, and so ended one of the most enthusiastic and happy gatherings I ever knew. The day was perfect, and there was nothing but success. I forgot to say that in the midst of the services it was announced that General Fremont was appointed Commander-in-Chief, an announcement which was received with immense cheering, as would have been almost anything else, I verily believe, at that moment of a high tide. It was shouted across the pickets above, a way in which we often receive news, but not always trustworthy. January 3rd, 1863. Once, and once only thus far, the water has frozen in my tent, and the next morning showed a dense white frost outside. We have still mocking-birds and crickets and rosebuds, and occasional noonday baths in the river, though the butterflies have vanished, as I remember to have observed in Fayal after December. I have been here nearly 6 weeks without a rainy day. 1 or 2 slight showers there have been, once interrupting a drill, but never dress parade. For climate, by day we might be among the Isles of Greece, though it may be my constant familiarity with the names of her sages which suggests that impression. For instance, a voice just now called, near my tent, "Cato, whar's Plato?" The men have somehow got the impression that it is essential to the validity of a marriage that they should come to me for permission, just as they used to go to the master, and I rather encourage these little confidences, because it is so entertaining to hear them. "Now, Cunnel," said a faltering swarm the other day, "I want to get me one good lady," which I approved, especially the limitation as to number. Afterwards I asked one of the bridegroom's friends whether he thought it was a good match. "Oh, yes, Cunnel," he said, in all the cordiality of friendship, "John's gwine for marry Venus." I trust the goddess will prove herself a better lady than she appeared during her previous career upon this planet, but this naturally suggests the Isles of Greece again. January 7th. On first arriving, I found a good deal of anxiety among the officers as to the increase of desertions, that being the rock on which the Hunter Regiment split. Now this evil is very nearly stopped, and we are every day recovering the older absentees. One of the very best things that have happened to us was the half-accidental shooting of a man who had escaped from the guard-house, and was wounded by a squad sent in pursuit. He has since died, and this very eve rung another man, who escaped with him, came and opened the door of my tent, after being 5 days in the woods almost without food. His clothes were in rags, and he was nearly starved, poor foolish fellow, so that we can almost dispense with further punishment. Severe penalties would be wasted on these people, accustomed as they have been to the most violent passions on the part of the white men, but a mild inexorableness tells on them, just as it does on any other children. It is something utterly new to me, and it is thus far perfectly efficacious. They have a great deal of pride as soldiers, and a very little of severity goes a great way if it be firm and consistent. This is very encouraging. The single question which I asked of some of the plantation superintendents on the voyage was, "Do these people appreciate justice?" If they did, it was evident that all the rest would be easy. When a race is degraded beyond that point, it must be very hard to deal with them. They must mistake all kindnesses for indulgence, all strictness for cruelty. With these freed slaves there is no such trouble, not a particle. Let an officer be only just and firm, with a cordial, kindly nature, and he has no sort of difficulty. The plantation superintendents and teachers must have the same experience, they say, but we have an immense advantage in the military organization, which helps in 2 ways. It increases their self-respect, and gives us an admirable machinery for discipline, thus improving both the fulcrum and the lever. The wounded man died in the hospital, and the general verdict seemed to be, "Him brought it on hisself." Another soldier died of pneumonia on the same day, and we had the funerals in the evening. It was very impressive. A dense mist came up, with the moon behind it, and we had only the light of the pine splinters as the procession wound beneath the mighty moss-hung branches of the ancient grove. The groups around the grave, the dark faces, the red garments, the scattered lights, the misty boughs were weird and strange. The men sang one of their own wild chants. 2 crickets sang also, one on either side, and did not cease their little monotone, even when the 3 volleys were fired above the graves. Just before the coffins were lowered, an old man whispered to